this report on South Africa's unemployment crisis coming to the fore earlier this week, just to set the scene, where we have the official rate of unemployment sitting at 25%, already high by international standards. To what extent is this really reflective of the reality?
Well, in some respects it's not. We think a better measure of what's going on is the fact that only 41% of working age adults has a job in South Africa. That 41% includes people in the informal sector, includes people with temporary work. There are some exclusions that we think might be better off included. But international standards for that are in the 60% range. So we are a long way short of employment levels that we should be aspiring towards.
So, we're effectively looking at an underestimation of the crisis here. And what stands out from this report is that the correlation between economic and then employment growth has weakened over time. So why is that the case, and what are some of the factors driving this divergence?
Well, if you compare what's gone on in the last 20 years to what happened in the 20 years before that, in the formal sector, roughly speaking, 1% growth in the size of the economy led to a 1% growth in employment in the first 20 years. In the last 20 years, it's less than half of that. And it's not clear exactly, there are a lot of reasons why that's happened. The world has changed a great deal in those 20 years. But one of the key things that's happened is a wedge has been driven between productivity growth and costs to employers. And as long as that wedge grows and is there, we're going to struggle to fill the gap. And we really need to be looking at ways, firstly, to grow the economy more quickly, but also to make that growth more labour intensive. And I think we've seen a lot of initiatives on the part that government has instigated, but a lot of them are in the space of skill and capital intensive employment rather than labour intensive employment, and as long as that's the case, they're expensive jobs, and the more expensive the jobs, the harder it is to fill the gap on, particularly for people who have no experience and no skills and very little to offer employers.
Of course, some of the hindrances or hurdles to that is that we're all too cognizant of the legislative and regulatory pressures that have actually driven employers down this road where production is less labour instructive. So is that the first place we need to be starting?
We certainly think so. There are other things that we can look at. We've got another report coming out soon on the wage subsidy, which also helps narrow the wedge. But yes, we need to look at what the regulatory environment has done to the cost of employment. One example of that is the Newcastle story over the last year, where the Department of Labour is now looking to close down a 50 or 60 garment factories in Newcastle, which pay workers below the minimum wage established by the Bargaining Council. Now, those are workers that want to keep those jobs, and employers are saying we simply can't meet the minimum wages. It's not just a question of minimum wages. There are a lot of other costs that employers have to bear, but you can create low-wage jobs in South Africa. They can be made economically viable, but they can't necessarily be made legal, and that's an important.
Of course, we've got a business having to contend with a pretty strong labour movement or labour force as well. I mean, we're in the middle of wage negotiation season in South Africa, and we see the power that labour wields contributing to that high cost pressures and ultimately leading to less of that pie to actually go around.
Yes, I mean, we've set up a labour relations regime that does encourage, puts very few brakes on the demands for increased remuneration, and which also make it very difficult to match those demands to improve productivity. So the extension of agreements to non-parties through the Bargaining Council structures and the Minister of Labour's determinations means that you might agree to 12% at the Bargaining Council, but at a firm level, it might be difficult to achieve those productivity gains without job losses. It's always possible to increase productivity by firing the least productive workers.
Yeah. Of course, if we're looking at the other side of the coin there, I mean, what are some of the risks of reform like this coming through? Because some say it would jeopardize the incomes of millions of working South Africans.
I think that's less of a risk than is sometimes stated. I think that there's very little international evidence of firms lowering remuneration. I think what we need to see in South Africa, we've got an industrial structure that has at the one end very low productivity, very low wage firms, basically in the informal sector. And on the other end of it, quite high wage, high productivity firms, essentially high productivity because their costs are high, and in order to meet those costs, they've got to have either high productivity or they've got to have monopoly power in the market. What we need to do is try and figure out how to get firms with intermediate levels of productivity and intermediate levels of wages in the formal sector. I think that that's possible. I think that we've ignored the space at the bottom end of the value chain in South Africa, and a lot of our economic thinking and our economic strategies aimed at rising up the value chain in the global supply chain, whereas maybe what we should be doing is looking at the bottom end and looking at intermediate levels of productivity and wages.
Of course, when it comes to government's role, I mean, we've had that 9 billion rand jobs fund having been created to quicken the pace of employment, but that stands hand in hand with the fact that we've got research claiming that South Africa is rapidly expanding its welfare state as well. So there are push and pull factors to consider here. To what extent do you see the situation we face as a result of South Africa's social welfare net?
The welfare net, the argument is that it keeps people out of the labour market. I'm not sure that that's entirely true in South Africa. There's contradictory evidence on this. Our welfare net is not, generally welfare in South Africa is not paid to working age adults. It's paid to children via working age adults, and it's paid to in the form of old age pensions. 60-something% of welfare goes to those two groups. The rest is disabilities and things like that. So it's not clear to me that people are staying out of the labour market, I think, because of welfare. I think they're staying out of the labour market because the labour market is not offering very many jobs. And so, you know, it's costly to actually look for a job. It's costly to move to a city and look for a job, and I think people have stayed away from that. So a more dynamic economy, I think, would draw people into the labour market. At the same time, you know, there is probably some effect that welfare is having on some people and keeping them out, because it is obviously possible to stay out of the informal sector potentially because there is welfare coming into the household.
To what extent, and this is the old, the old age adage, to what extent can unemployment be explained by poor skills levels? I mean, is that, it's a reason given, but does it explain the unemployment situation?
No, we don't think so. I mean, a lot of government's attempts to close this gap between the costs of employment and productivity are aimed at skills development. So the argument being you raise the skills profile of workers, and then they'll be more productive, and therefore you can afford to pay them or employers can afford to employ them. That has proved to be very inefficient and very expensive. Our skills enhancement strategies have not been very successful. We think that the big problem with skills development in South Africa is that people have not got any workplace experience. So a very large proportion of unemployed people and a huge proportion of young unemployed people have never had a job. A lot of the skills that one needs in order to be employable are gained essentially on the job. Discipline, working with others, being able to take instructions and fulfill them. You can't train these things in courses. So there is an argument about skills being a problem, but you've really got to create a labour market that creates jobs for the workers you have rather than the workers you wish you had. And we haven't done that. We've created a labour market that protects people who've got jobs at the expense of people who don't.